Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second part of today's conference, and thank you very much that you're all back again. The second topic is perspectives on cultural, political, and legal identity, one Europe and maybe many Europeans. We are very excited and very thrilled to more or less, world famous speakers for that panel. And I just agreed with Professor Weiler, only, 10 words of introduction, because otherwise, you'll be bored. And our two speakers are just, too famous and, too active to really concisely introduce themselves. Professor Weiler is one of the most well-known European lawyers, professor at NYU in New York. He has been president of European University Institute in Florence. He has many honorary doctorates, and he has written on our topic so extensively that I think I do not need to say any more words to introduce him. We are very excited and thrilled to have you here, Professor Weiler. And our next guest is Professor Eli Salzberger. I'm also in particular happy that you could make it, because you are an honorary doctor of our faculty, professor at Haifa University, and in many ways also related with the University of Hamburg, for instance, within the cooperation within the Minerva Institute. And what I also find in particular exciting, that we have a European lawyer from an American perspective and a non-EU lawyer from an Israel perspective. So an outsider to some extent, but I'm quite sure that also Professor Salzberger will join many insights with us, and I'm quite sure that Professor Weiler will share many insights with us. So dear Professor Weiler, if you want to start, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, it's an honor. And although the theme is the European Union as an actor in global affairs, I think we have to first take an inside look, because the world is not dumb. And the world is aware of the internal crisis that is besetting Europe. And we can define this crisis in many ways, but it's not the classical problem of foreign policy, the inability of the European Union to translate its internal strength to external power, nor the decision-making process, the ambiguity between the High Representative and the President of the Council and all that. What is really compromising the credibility of the European Union are in three internal dimensions. First of all, it's really the growing dimension of Euroscepticism. Think about it. Marine Le Pen won the elections, the European Parliament elections last time round. And if we look now and combine the support for Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, it's more than Macron. And I deliberately speak about France and not the usual suspects, Poland and Hungary, because we see similar developments in Italy with Salvini, in Holland, in Finland, in Sweden, even in Germany. Euroscepticism is no longer part of the lunatic fringe on the left and right, it's mainstream politics. And it translates into the decisional difficulties of the Union. But we have to ask ourselves what accounts for this Euroscepticism. And the second thing that is troubling, and I will mention it, but I will not analyze it. I only have 20 minutes, which is a little, but it's more than Twitter, so we should thank God for small mercies. Large segments of European population are turning their back on the basic values of liberal democracy. Again, I can cite, it's not the lunatic fringe on the left and right. It's become mainstream, and not only in Poland and in Hungary. And that also compromises the credibility of the European Union to speak as it likes to think of itself, as a community of values, soft power, and all the rest. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what accounts for this Euroscepticism? There are many reasons, but I'm going to focus on two. So we have one founding myth for the last 30, 40 years. The myth is that if we think back to the first direct elections to the European Parliament in 1979, it was a relatively low turnout by reference to turnout in European politics. So please don't tell me, but in America, it's even worse. We could spend a lot of hours on the crisis of American democracy and credibility, etc. But we're talking about Europe. And the usual explanation was, why should the people go and vote if the European Parliament is powerless? It's just a debating chamber. And then the prediction was, once the European Parliament gets real power, you will see that citizens will begin to vote, because if it has real power, their vote will count. Reality was different. In every elections since 1979 to the European Parliament, the turnout of voters was lower and lower. The exception, the last election, where it went up by 1 or 2 percentage points, and paradoxically, that can account to the mobilization of Euroscepticism and not as an indication of support. If we look at Eurobarometers, it's the lowest level of support on record for the European Union. And one reason is the myth that by giving the European Parliament extensive powers, and now it is a co-legislator with the Council, that we have solved the democracy deficit in the European Union, and we have not. If we think across our democratic systems, they're different. Austria is not Germany, and Germany is not Italy, and Italy is not France, and France is not Latvia. But there are two basic things that characterize all our democracies in a very primitive, primordial sense. One, and which is in some ways the mobilization in our reduced form of Republican democracy of people and voters. It's the thought that when I go and vote for Parliament, at least I can have two types of impact. I can impact by whom I will be governed. Will it be Macron, or will it be Le Pen, or will it be Salvini, or will it be Draghi, etc.? So I can have, if enough people vote the way I do, we can determine in a very impactful way by whom we will be governed. And that's important. And we can add to that British adage, the possibility to throw the scoundrels out. If I don't like them, I can throw them out and change them. And the second thing is, again, it's weak, but it is existence. If enough people vote the way I do, it will have an impact on the direction the polity takes in its policies. So if there's a majority of the center-left, it will be center-left policies. We see this in Germany as we are talking. If there is a majority of the center-right, it will be a center-right policies. There are, of course, nuances, but in 20 minutes, we forget about nuances. And these two primordial things, they don't define democracy, but it's like the hallmark on gold. If you don't see it, it's not gold. Simply do not exist in the governance structure of the European Union. When we vote for the European Parliament, and I speak as a European citizen, when we vote for the European Parliament, we have absolutely no impact on whom we will be governed, as we saw in the last election. I yield to nobody in my respect for Ms. van der Leyen, but she was elected by Macron and Merkel, not by the peoples of Europe, and against the wishes of the European Parliament. And no study has been able to show, except in an anecdotal way, a connection between voter preference when it comes to policies and the conduct of the European elections. When we have European elections and the parties campaign, they campaign on national politics. Why? Because they cannot make a credible promise. If you vote for me, things in Europe will be different. So you compare the platforms, the electoral platforms of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, they read the same. Motherhood and apple pie. We all want high employment. We all want digital society. We all want a community of values, but nobody can credibly say, if you vote for me, it will really make a difference. And it's not because these are corrupt or nefarious politicians. It's a structural issue in the European Union. And the result is, if we take Brexit, the Brexit trauma, because it is a trauma, a country like Great Britain leaving the European Union, they left not because the government wanted to leave, it's because the people decided to leave. And the slogan was taking back control. And if you look through the national politics in our member states, in different guises, this is one of the driving forces of Euroscepticism, taking back control. So really, in a deep sense, I'm afraid to say it, the democracy deficit in a profound sense persists. And I hope that none of the questions will say, but this is not a state. Of course, it's not a state. We don't want it to be a state, but it is a system of extensive governance of public and private issues in our lives. And democracy means that when there is exercise of public power, it has to be legitimated democratically, and it's not. So I move to the second point. How does the European Union, and especially if I look at the ethos of the Commission, legitimate themselves? And historically, it's been sometimes expressis verbis. You know, we lawyers like to use Latin, then we can charge higher fees. Expressis verbis, they say we should be judged by results. We deliver the goods. It's output legitimacy. The Romans had a good name for it, bread and circus. As long as we give them good results, we are legitimate. Now, bread and circus, or to be more polite, output legitimacy, of course, is important. But output legitimacy with no or with weak input legitimacy has two dangers. One is obvious, it's fickle. Because the minute you don't deliver the results, like in 2008 or in the early days of COVID, etc., you lose your legitimacy. In a democracy which is based not only on output, but on input legitimacy, you don't lose your legitimacy because that's the government the people voted for. This is the program that people wanted. And you derive your legitimacy from the input process, not just the output process. So that is one weakness. It's fickle. It's not deep if it's just output. But there's a deeper problem with it. Here we have to go to Herder, who was, of course, the Nazis used Herder, and that's why he went out of fashion in political theory, but Isaiah Berlin luckily redeemed him. And Herder spoke of a community of fate, and a community of fate is really essential to our democracy because demos is essential to our democracy. No demos, no democracy. And what does a community of fate mean? You might hate what's happening in Austria, you might hate what's happening in Germany, you might hate what's happening in Poland, but you don't say, okay, I leave Poland. It's my country, it's my community, it's my society. I have to make it better, I have to fight for it. When you have output legitimacy in the European Union, a big word, it becomes a utilitarian calculus. The more expressive view is what's in it for me. And every time there's a crisis, politicians ask what's in it for me, and they do not think from a member state point of view about the collective good. It's my society. Now, I think the recovery fund was a wonderful thing, but it was solidarity among governments, executive branches. It was not solidarity of the people. If we look at what the people in the northern countries, the Austrians, the Germans, the Finns, the Dutch, etc., they had little appetite for, quote, I'm quoting the Dutch Minister of Finance, for these lazy Spaniards who spend their money on women and wine. A terrible remark in more than one way. And why is that so? Because it's a calculus of what's in it for me. It lacks that deep solidarity that comes from a community of fate. If there's a flood in New Orleans, people in California don't say, this is New Orleans, it's not San Francisco. It's their fellow Americans. And that sense of these are our fellow Europeans is very, very weak. It's as weak as the number of times we hear the word solidarity. We say solidarity so often because we know that it exists in a weak form. So these two things are translated also into policy, because when we get to big decisions of foreign policy, like Russia, like China, like the Nord Stream gas pipe, like sanctions on Ukraine, etc., countries are thinking, what's in it for me too when it comes to the foreign policy? And when the world, which I started my speech saying is not dumb, people are aware of what is happening in Europe. They are aware of these fractures. They are aware of these issues. And I must say, my whole speech today could come under the title, what should be on the agenda on the Conference for the Future of Europe, and will not be. Because you not see that the institutional dimension is on the agenda for the future of Europe. It works on the assumption that institutionally everything is hunky-dory. So now I go to my third point. The myth of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a terrible principle because, again, it's a functionalist utilitarian principle. We should do at the European Union what we can do better together than at a member state level. But I belong to the thesis that says that fundamental boundaries in federal type structure are as important as fundamental rights. In other words, people want to feel that there are zones of activity, of action, of policy, of values, which are ours, which define our identity. So I'm moving from the European identity to the member state identity. And that just does not prevail in Europe. You want the proof? Forget about the terrible decision of the Polish Constitutional Court recently. We have a similar decision from the Danish Supreme Court, from the Czech Supreme Court, from the Conseil d'État, and best or worst of all, from the German Constitutional Court in the Weise decision. Now, what explains that? And think about it. Somebody like Barnier, Michel Barnier, commissioner, the negotiator of the European Union with Brexit, who was so angry with the Brits when they said, we have problems with the authority of the European Court of Justice, when Barnier himself proposed a referendum in France on the authority and the supremacy of European Union law. Now, I know he did it for internal political reasons, but the fact that it wasn't any longer a taboo, that he could propose that, is meaningful. Mm-hmm. What's the problem? The problem is that the European Court of Justice has been a terrible, it's a wonderful court in many ways. We wouldn't have the European Union as we know it today without the European Court of Justice. But when it comes to be the policeman of the jurisdictional limits of the European Union, the member states' court have lost confidence in the European Court of Justice. That's a serious problem, because if the constitutional architecture of the European Union is compromised, we're in deep trouble. And again, my overall thesis, that is reflected also in our external action. Now, just come to one last issue that directly, and then if I have time, but it could also be in a Q&A, people will ask, okay, so what should we do about it? I have some ideas what we should do about it. But let me touch the last issue, and that's security and defense. If you were to ask me, what is the fundamental platform of European defense over the last 60, 70 years? The answer is the American cavalry. If we're really in the shit, the Americans will come and pull us out of it as they have done in the past. Let's get used to the idea the Pax Americana is over. The Pax Americana is over. It's for a variety of reasons that could be the subject of a whole lecture. I even published a tiny book on that. Sorry for being self-referential. But one of the reasons, as somebody living in the United States, we, the Americans, no longer have the appetite to be the policemen of the world. We saw this in a very dramatic way in Afghanistan. I'm not sure the Americans would really go if the Russians invaded Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia. Will we really want Americans be willing to do that? I'm not even sure about Taiwan. But Europe has to get used to the idea that the Pax Americana is over. And what is so frustrating, it's this nonsense that the core of sovereignty is defense. That's thinking of the 19th century. The core of sovereignty in today's world is social policy. Defense, no European country has the capacity to defend itself. So how can that be the core of sovereignty? Not even France, not even when they were part of the Union, the United Kingdom. No member state of the Union has the capacity to defend itself. We can only do it together. And the frustrating datum is the following. If we take the combined expenditure of defense in the 27 member states, they are greater than the defense budget of Russia. It's just we deploy it in a deplorable way. Armies with more generals than soldiers, with different weapons because of special interests of the European defense industry, etc. How can we be a credible international actor if we continue, in my view, as a euphemism, to celebrate ourselves as a soft power? It doesn't count in today's world. Now, I'm not bellicose. I'm not saying the European Union should go tomorrow to war, but I am saying that if this happens, and I remind you, and with this I will end, this wonderful book by Christopher Clark, Sleepwalkers, who showed how in February and March 1914, if anybody in Europe would say within 6 months there would be a war of the kind we have never known before, people would laugh at them. They would say, what are you talking about? So we can't dismiss the security threat, let alone other types of security threats, so-called terrorism, etc. And we are just not equipped to deal with it. There is more collaboration between the Brits and the Americans and the Australians on matters of security than there is between the French, the Germans, and the Austrians. It's troubling. I think I should finish here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Weiler. I'm quite sure that in the question and answer session, we will come back to your offer talking about the remedies, because the analysis is a bit kind of, depressing, but I think absolutely to the point and addresses many of the things that we are driven by in many, discussions, in political contexts in Europe, in legal contexts in Europe. And we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. But I'm very excited also to see Professor Salzberger's perspective, whether it's more kind of, optimistic, pessimistic is not the right dichotomy in that context. I think the critical analysis is absolutely convincing, but I'm quite excited to learn, what your perspectives on these topics would be. Professor Salzberger, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotzur. You insisted on my participation in this panel, despite the fact that, unlike Professor Weiler, I'm really not an expert on the European Union or the European integration process. My fields of interests and academic specialties are very, very remote. So I can talk here only as a layperson who represent only himself. You ask us to contribute a foreign, on external, on outsider's perspective on European identity or European Union identity. And I think this begs the question, begs addressing the concept of what is a foreign or external or outsider perspective in the European context, and also relating to what is perspective in the context of European identity. And I want to relate to these two issues before giving you my own 2 cents on the state of the EU and European identity. And in a sense, the first point, who is a foreigner vis-a-vis Europe, who is insider, who is an outsider, was touched upon also by Professor Botta, but I think I approach it a little bit different. It's a very important question. The mere question, who is an insider, can reflect on the existence of European identity or European Union identity. And the formal legalistic answer is that the citizen of one of the member states is an insider, and all others are outsiders. But this is a very simplistic and unsatisfying reply when the question is, what is, or is there a European identity? Because on the one hand, not only that there are numerous EU citizens who know hardly anything about the EU rationale and history and institution, and even the hot topics of debate on the level of the EU. Too many EU citizens do not share what is called European values, heritage, culture. And on the other hand, many non-Europeans, nationals, perhaps will not pass the test on EU institutions and decision-making processes, but are deeply committed to the proclaimed ideas, heritage, political culture, and general culture of Europe. The Jews is an interesting collective example. You know, in many respects, the past Jews of European nationals were the first pan-Europeans, and most of their descendants are living today outside Europe. There is a beautiful novel by the Israeli author A.B. Yoshua, A Journey to the End of the Millennium, in which he described a journey of a Jewish merchant from Spain who travels to Germany with his two wives. It was still allowed to have two wives then, and meets a very wise German woman, kind of an early version of Gluckel of Hamlin. All this towards the end of the first millennium, and how they have very initial differences, but they find common grounds and leave mutual footprints on each other. My own family history is also another example. You know, my four grandparents came from different European corners: St. Petersburg, Sopron in the Austrian-Hungarian border, Bukovina in Romania, and Breslau, or today Wroclaw. And my Sopron-born grandmother married a Viennese, and then she was widowed and married my grandfather, who by the time moved from Breslau through Hamburg to Frankfurt on Main. And my sons actually managed to trace the ancestor of my mother family almost to the first German Jews. And they moved about east and west, returning to Germany. And finally, in the 20th century, were either eliminated or exiled. They had European identity, but none of their descendants today are European. Or, you know, the Jerusalem neighborhood that I grew up in, I think Professor Weiler grew up in the same neighborhood. Rehavia was a European multi-culti neighborhood, long before such neighborhood existed in Europe. On one corner of a street, you could hear someone playing Mozart. On the other corner, people debated Goethe or Heine. And on the third corner, there was a big discussion between Professor Tedeschi and Professor Rabello in Italian. Both of them were my teachers at law school. And we kids read the best of European children literature, all European literature, translated and published in Hebrew, from Enid Blyton through Selma Lagerlöf, the Amici, Ferenc Smolner, and of course, Erich Kästner. How many kids in Europe today delve into these different branches of European culture and landscapes? Well, this goes as far as external, internal perspective on Europe. If one cannot show distinctive feature of exclusion, a random group of EU citizens, which are different from a random group of non-EU citizens, it is difficult to acknowledge a distinctive European Union identity. This brings me to a word on perspective. You know, perspective means a point of view, including an angle, but also a distance. And I think the perspective, as we heard in the first session, on the EU by neighbors is very different from those who are very far apart. And in this sense, the concept of neighborhood is both geographic, but also a cultural or value one. Neighbors of Europe are on the one hand much more aware of the EU as an institution. It affects their life, and directly and also indirectly. But on the other hand, they are much more aware of the immense differences between the different nations of Europe. And often they know insiders' knowledge of different European cultures more than European knows about a different member state European. And this is the advantage of an external perspective. And I think that most of your neighbors do not view the EU as a state or even as a federation. And for those who are very far away from Europe, the difference maybe among Europeans are maybe more blurred, but most of them are not aware at all that the EU exists. And I think in this respect, another significant difference is the perspective between those who consider themselves outsiders and insiders with regard to sharing values or political culture, Europolitical philosophy, social and legal norms, and culture in a broader sense, and those outsiders who have total different heritage and believe in different values. The EU from a Chinese perspective, we heard this morning, is very different from an EU from an Australian or South African perspective, because the Chinese base their perspective on a very different aspiration to different values. So this brings me to say my own perspective, which is of a neighbor, almost an insider, who shares and aspires to what is called European values. And I think, you know, we know it all, but the background for the establishment of the EU is crucial for analyzing and evaluating the EU today, its identity. And we have to remember all that. We have to remember that the first half of this 20th century witnessed extreme nationalism, bringing to 2 world wars, 80 million deaths, total devastation of the continent, and European integration was the Western liberal democratic antidote to this dreadful first half of the 20th century. But we know from COVID, from recent COVID developments, that effectiveness of antidotes wears with time. And soon there will be no living witnesses of the formative period and what preceded it. And this is a very important thing. So the EU was semi-disguised an economic treaty when it was established, semi-disguised because the goal of the 6-member founding state was to keep the peace. And in this respect, if we view the EU from this perspective, it's a great success. You know, 74 years of peace in Europe are the longest period of peace in Europe ever. And in a sense, this is probably the most important achievement of the EU. A second important achievement is this enlargement process. You know, when the EC was established by the 6 countries, and during the first couple of decades of the EC, totalitarian prevailed in many parts of Europe, West and East. It's hard to believe, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and of course the communist bloc. And the 80s and 90s were very optimistic decades when the fall of the Iron Curtain, the integration of new democracies of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe to the European project. And this period, you know, which liberal democracy worldwide had its best ever era. And in a sense, the European democratization and integration was a beacon for many other parts of the world. But it also very important to remember that when the EU was established, or the EEC, and then the EEC, it was kind of a body and institutions and decision-making processes without very little substantive content. The soul of Europe was attributed, can be attributed much earlier to 1949, the establishment of the Council of Europe, the European Convention of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights, and the integration, okay, of the economic purposes, the peace purposes, the economic prosperity purposes, with the values of democracy, freedom, human rights, came later, only in the 90s, maybe the Maastricht Treaty, and maybe culminated in the Lisbon Treaty. You know, I told you that I'm a layperson, and I read some parts of the Lisbon Treaty to prepare for today's session. I was quite surprised by many reforms it introduced that I was not aware of, such as the role of national parliaments in the process of the EU legislation, and the reform in the decision-making procedures in the various institutions of the EU. The reforms were meant not only to move the EU closer to a united politicals or to a statehood, which plays on an international arena. They also meant to increase the democratic legitimacy of and the democratic nature from within. This is very similar to what Professor Weiler said. There is a connection, of course, between these two aspects and goals. Statehood or state-like actor for external purposes depends on recognition of sovereignty from within by the EU citizens. And Lisbon Treaty sets a very high bar for itself. But I'm afraid that the history since the Lisbon Treaty shows that the EU did not succeed to reach this bar. Why? First and foremost, the EU failed its mission to promote liberal democratic values and practices, now that it is one of its main manifestos. You know, as was said, nationalism, populism, separatism, inward-looking, anti-democratic voices are back on stage, on center stage, as we heard in France and other countries. And some countries voted those forces into power already and are dismantling key components of democracy, such as academic freedom, media freedom, independent courts, introducing anti-liberal legislation, even constitutional amendments. At least 3 countries of the EU are now defined as black-siding democracies. And also, like in the optimistic 1990s, in which many parts of the world followed the European example, so happens today when democratic regression in Europe affects and is affected by other parts of the world, like a domino effect, and I'm afraid that Israel is part of this domino chain. For an outsider like me, it is puzzling, especially in light of the EU enhancement by the Lisbon Treaty of its values, to see that some of its member states are no more democracies. How can EU be regarded as one political entity when it claims to be a model of liberal democracy and parts of it are not? A second failure, also discussed earlier, so I think there is a consensus among the speakers here. The second failure is a failure of solidarity, which manifested itself in the economic crisis of 2008 and the subsequent Greek debt crisis, during the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, and now during the Corona crisis. You know, the real vigor of a polity is best measured in time of crisis. For some political philosopher, extreme conditions are maybe the sole rationale for the existence of a political unity or a state. And in all these recent emergencies, the EU failed to adopt clear, relevant, common policies to mitigate the crisis. In such extreme conditions, a united or coordinated policy is a key to successful management and mitigation of the crisis. And the current state of the COVID in Europe speaks for itself. More coordination, homogeneous policy would have not brought Europe to the stage that it is today. And solidarity is a very important component in the quality of a polity, and a certain degree of lack of solidarity, I think, that can negate the mere existence of such a polity. When, you know, these 2 points of failures are mentioned, it's not really surprising that the EU did not really make it to become a significant or meaningful state actor on the international arena. Had the EU been a player on the international arena as sovereign state, its wealth, size of population, and despite its military weakness, its arms would have placed it in the big league of US, China, Russia. In reality, the EU as an international player is weaker than some of its member states. When the German or the foreign or the French foreign ministers are coming to a visit in Israel, it is viewed both by the Israeli public and by Israeli officials as much more important than a visit of the high representative of the Union. So let me say a word of conclusion. Europe was the birthplace of the modern ideas about how to govern ourselves, the ideas of social contract, democracy, freedom, the rule of law, human rights. The 18th century Enlightenment also tilted the world towards science, rationality, facts, truth. And I think the theories of the state thought that the government structure that they advocate will promote and entrench these elements of modern life. We are now in a second, very soon third consecutive decade of democratic deterioration. I'm not familiar if there are similar indexes to the democratic indices regarding the level of rationality, belief in science, and telling between truth and false, but we all see what's happening around us: fake news, alternative truths, conspiracy theories. To paraphrase Joachim Sauer, the fact that a third of the Germans are not vaccinated may mean that a third of the Germans do not believe in science. So in other words, we witness today a decline in the real ideal state as portrayed by European heritage, alongside connected decline in the basic values that were in the foundation of this ideal state, because it cannot protect and promote those anymore. And I don't think that the EU is different. And the political philosophies of the 18th century, or the philosophies of the 18th centuries, were written against a very different technological frontiers. And in a sense, it is really puzzling that we still conduct our life today according to the 18th century theories of the state. Take it, for example, majority decision-making of representatives who are elected for term of office and are meant to represent their voters. Majority rule as a collective decision-making process or rule doesn't have first-order philosophical justification. It's a compromise because of technological frontiers. Today, technology enables us better kind of proxy to the best decision-making processes. Likewise, the solution of elected representative reflected a certain belief about their ability to represent their voter. Again, a point that was referred to by Professor Weiler. And today, it's much easier to capture elected representative voter, and the ideas of the 18th century theories of the state do not hold. We don't know. What we need is a new theory of a state adapted to the 21st century. And in this respect, I think that, the Europeans have immense opportunities because it is not yet a real united actor. Like the founding American fathers, like the opportunities that they had 250 years ago. But so far, I'm afraid that the EU does not meet these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Salzberger. Thank you very much, Professor Weiler, for two excellent presentations. I strongly encourage the audience to use the question and answer button to bring up their questions. There are already first question I've seen, but I'd like to abuse my position because there are so many exciting questions I really want to get rid of. I'm very grateful, Professor Salzberger, that you challenged our title, which was, of course, very provocative. If you distinguish between insiders and outsiders, foreign and not foreign, it is always quite misleading. And that was exactly something that we wanted to highlight, that, you know, these dichotomies and these kind of, you know, pictures that we have are to some extent labels or cliches that do not prove to be convincing. So I think that was a very important first remark. And your last remark, I think, is a huge challenge for us. We need a new theory of the state. So that is something which I think is the grand question in the background. But it's also maybe a question that has been to some extent at least addressed by what Professor Weiler has said about, you know, the legitimacy of the European Union, these observations that even though the Parliament got, you know, at least formally more and more powers and strengths, it did not work that the voters all of a sudden would contribute more and would participate in the elections. The numbers, there's a continuous decline with some exceptions. Also because of the fact, if I understood you correctly, that nobody is really sure what the Parliament decides, what kind of political parties are the strong and powerful ones. So these taking back control issue, who controls at the European plane, I think that's a grand challenge. And you also said, Professor Weiler, that output legitimacy is a shortcoming, obviously, because, and I think that's the most striking example, if you do not deliver the outcome, then you are not legitimate anymore. And more complex political situations are, the less likely it is that, you know, politicians will be able to deliver sufficiently convincing outcome, let alone outcome that is believed by all citizens to be the right answer. And of course, both of your statements bring me to the kind of, you know, million-dollar question: what are the remedies? And Professor Weiler, you promised that you know, maybe in the Q&A session you might start with that, and that would be my first question. And also a bit provocative regarding to what Professor Salzberger said. Would you also at the end of the day agree that, you know, a part of the solution is, next to institutional questions and so on, that we also need a completely new theory of the state which is more adequate to the 21st century and thus not kind of, you know, resemble the grand ideas of, you know, the age of enlightenment in the 18th century?
You want me to say something?
Absolutely, of course. And be provocative and challenge us. So the more
I have 2 or 3 just preliminary comments. The main message I tried to, no, I'll say something before. I suppose some of you read The Economist. If you want to know what's going around in the world, it's a pretty good place to read. But if I had to have a legend for The Economist, a kind of coat of arms, it would say, simplify and exaggerate. And I must say my speech is, because we have so little time, is a little bit like The Economist: simplify and exaggerate. And also my answers will be a little bit simplify and exaggerate.
Which is perfect.
The second thing I want to say is, I remember maybe 25 years ago, I was invited to some conference in Bologna, celebrating the oldest university in Europe, 900 years or whatever it was. And it was one of these huge 5-day conferences, and they brought people from literally all over the world to speak of the state of human rights in their respective countries. And it felt to me to be the concluding, the keynote at the end. And I remember saying, if a Martian would come down to Earth and listen to this conference and have to report on the state of human rights, he or she or it would report back, human rights in planet Earth are wonderful, there's a little problem in Sweden. If we read the treaties and we read the decisions, etc., on paper it all looks good. It's how it translates into action, into day and day, that we should be looking on. And my overall theme was, going back to Europe as an international actor, it used to be that we would say Europe has tremendous internal strength. They just haven't found the instruments to translate it into external strength. And today it's no longer the case. Today, Europe is internally weakened, and it is that which is compromising as well its ability to translate as an effective international player. Now, to address some of the remedies to the problems I said. So the lack of input legitimacy, and it doesn't contradict what Ellie said, because I still think that these two primordial principles I said, it's not the day-to-day management of policy, but who will govern us and in what broad direction remains valuable today, even with all the differences of technology, etc. So here are some things. One cannot explain why there are still no European parties. And the reason I say that is because it does not need a treaty amendment. If the different groups in the European Parliament decided to contest their elections as European-wide parties, they would be able to actually develop a program and say, if you vote for us, we will make sure that the Commission follows this mandate that we get from the voters. And we would suddenly see differences in the policy options. And what is politics without choice? What is politics if the voter doesn't have at least some kind of difference? It's hard to explain why that has not happened. Well, one can, of course, explain everything. So it's a normative statement. It should happen. It will make a huge difference if the next elections to the European Parliament, there were European-wide parties contesting the elections. Now, I want to remind the people who might still be listening to me of something that happened in 1965, the Luxembourg Compromise. The Luxembourg Compromise happened because, according to the treaties, majority voting had to come in. Nobody had an appetite for majority voting in 1965. So the member states got together and had the Luxembourg Accord, which said, we will respect the veto even in areas where there should be majority voting. Why do I mention it? Because here is a huge structural change in decision-making that did not require a treaty amendment. If they agree, that's what happened. Why is it relevant today? Think of the proposal of that wise sage of European integration, Jean-Claude Piris. He said, we can't do away with a veto, but it should be a collective veto. We should agree that to veto something, you need at least 3 states, or 4 states, or 5 states. Now, I'm not stupid or totally stupid. That would be politically difficult, but not impossible. And then when I propose this, people say you need a treaty amendment and nobody is thinking of a new intergovernmental conference on a new treaty. You don't need a treaty amendment. And this will be a game changer. If there was a new Luxembourg Accord, that the veto, instead of being one member state, a member state who wanted to veto would have to mobilize support from at least 3 or 4 or 5 other member states. We can argue about the details. So just think, including in the context of foreign policy, what a difference it would make if we didn't have to negotiate internally towards the lowest common denominator. And we can do this without a treaty amendment. It's only the political will that is lacking. Third issue is a much bigger issue. And I know that European thinkers divide, and I am clearly in one camp, but I see the difficulties. It's politicizing the Commission. Mm-hmm. It was my fate, I should say, or my luck perhaps, that not in the last elections to the European Parliament, but the one before that, I moderated the television debate between the candidates to the presidency of the European Commission. And I asked them the same question. If your party wins, do you think the Commission should reflect the political color of the majority of voters? Barroso said, absolutely not. And I think that is the current thinking in the Commission also today. Once we have a Commission, we have to be above party politics. It cannot be a left or center-left or center-right Commission. And other people say we won't have democracy until we have politicization of the European leadership. The people who are watching can work out for themselves. It definitely would be a risky move. There definitely would be a period of adjustment. But I think it's indispensable that the reflection of voter preference in elections to the European Parliament, especially if we have Europe-wide political parties, would also be reflected in the composition of the Commission. It doesn't have to be, it could be a form of coalition, etc. But the Commission should think of itself as a political actor. Why do I say that? Because of course they are a political actor, but it's sub silencio, with no accountability. They act politically. If there's austerity or if there's growth, these are political decisions. But the pretense that we are just technocrats, that we are thinking of the collective good of Europe, that we do not take sides in the political debates in Europe is a fiction. And therefore, when we reach the age of 70, it's time to get rid of this fiction and to politicize the Commission. So that's my third thing. The fourth thing would need a treaty amendment. Fasten your seatbelts, European taxation. Why do I say European taxation? It's not just the normal thing that probably, if we take the 5 or 6 major cities in Germany, their budget is bigger than that of the European community. Probably not, but you understand the order of magnitude. That when we have this kind of crisis, we don't need to go cap in hand and beg the Germans and beg the Finns and beg the Dutch. You really have to show solidarity to the Spaniards or the Italians who have suffered more, etc. So it's not just a question of more adequate own resources for the Union. Taxation is an instrument of democracy, no less important than voting. It's my money, what are you doing with it? Taxation brings accountability. Taxation sharpens political differences and creates choice. And therefore, I would also put on the agenda, although I don't think it will happen in my lifetime, I'm pretty old, a real fiscal reform, not just harmonizing of fiscal rules, renegotiating the Stability Pact, etc., but actually having European taxation. It will also be more progressive, because the way the Union is funded now is not particularly progressive from a social justice point of view. So those are my few suggestions, just simplify and exaggerate, of dealing with the first problem I dealt with. What about fundamental boundaries, that there is a value in having clear limits to the competences and jurisdiction of the European Union? In other words, it's an anti-subsidiarity measure. Even if you can do it better, this is something we want to do on our own. And we don't just allow the European Union to get into any field, because you know the subsidiarity. It's so malleable. I've actually analyzed quite a few years ago. When the Commission doesn't want to do something, they say no subsidiarity. When they want to do something, there's always subsidiarity. So what's the answer to that? On the one hand, we need a single judicial voice to decide if the Union is acting intra vires or ultra vires. We can't have the court in Germany saying one thing and the court in France saying another thing. Not only because it's, how will this work? Because the European Union, unlike other international organizations, is a legislative and it's governance, and we're talking about European citizens. Austria is part, or the European Union is part of the WTO. We are not citizens of the WTO. So it cannot be that in the interest of equal application of the law, that French citizens will have rights which German citizens do not have. So we need a single voice to decide intra vires, ultra vires. But what do we do if we have this increasing rebellion by the courts of the member states? And my analysis, nobody likes to say it, it's because they lost confidence in the European Court of Justice as the policeman of the jurisdictional limits. So together with a colleague in Spain, Daniel Sarmiento, we proposed not a perfect solution, because you know the best is the enemy of the good, a second best solution, which is on issues of intra vires, ultra vires, to have a new chamber of the European Court of Justice. And this chamber will be composed of judges of the European Court of Justice, but also sitting judges of the constitutional courts of the member states. Will it totally solve the problem? Probably not. But will that chamber have much greater legitimacy than the current setup? For sure. And I insist it's not in the public eye. You don't find it on the front page, even of the Financial Times. But the question of, are there limits to the jurisdiction of the Union? Can they do anything they want, etc., is very deeply rooted in the current dissatisfaction, which is translated into this Euroscepticism. And the last thing, I talked about security. The problem of security, okay, the word is overused, it's political, but in the sense that I tried to explain before, it's the myth driven by special interests that security is the core of sovereignty. It's not in the current reality. I insist again, no member state has the ability to defend itself today. Even when it came to former Yugoslavia, even when it came to Libya, and I'm not talking whether it was right or wrong to interfere in Libya, we in Europe couldn't do it without the Americans. We didn't have the targeting capacity. We didn't have enough ammunition for more than 5 days. It's just as a simple example. The same is true also in security, in this kind of low-level security threats that we face. So the simplest answer is the most radical answer. We have to integrate our armies. It will take 5, 10, 15 years. And I say 5, 10, 15 years because we have to get rid of the generation of generals who are invested in the status quo. But I don't see any other solution, not creating a collective task force, etc. The only solution is integrating these puppet Pinocchio armies that we have now into a European army. It seems radical, but what rationally actually argues against it, except this visceral feel you're touching the core of our sovereignty? In one debate, people said to me, but you know, the army also plays an internal role. We don't have coup d'etats, right? But for example, if there's an earthquake in southern Italy, the army goes to help. Is it such a bad idea that the army that goes to help will have Austrian soldiers or Latvian soldiers or Polish soldiers? I don't see that. Now, and these are my last words to my simplify, exaggerate, some kind of remedies to the 3 problems I raise. We can talk from now till further notice. In my view, in my humble opinion, although I don't suppose I'm so humble, in my humble opinion, if we don't address these 3 core issues, we can have this webinar in 10 years from now and the agenda will be the same.
Absolutely. I could not agree more, Professor Weiler. I think that is straight to the point and some really very interesting and thought-provoking remedies. When you were talking about taxation, I kind of, remembered the sentence, the famous no taxation without representation, and it might be also the other way around, no representation without taxation, because, only if people see that there's a political community that can do something, that we have to pay money, that they
not only, I totally agree. I remember, and I got a lot of hate mail when I said no representation without taxation.
Yeah, so absolutely.
They adopt legislation without fiscal responsibility.
Absolutely.
We adopt the norms of environmental cleaning, but the member states have to pay for it.
Absolutely. And I think, you argued, and I find it very thought-provoking, also for a more political role of the Commission, if there would be the power, for taxation, that would automatically lead to a more political role, because, people feel that it's about policies, and it makes a difference whether it's, center right or center left when we are talking about, taxes. Will you invest in renewable energies, or will you build new highways or something like that? I think there is a close combination between these 2 reform points, and if you grant the competence to raise taxes, I think the pollution automatically will become more political.
You are much younger than I am, Professor Kotzur, so maybe it will happen in your lifetime, but I fear it will not happen in my lifetime.
Well, never give up hope, and I'm optimistic in that regard. Professor Salzberger, I also would like to come back to your kind of, we need to rethink, politics and statehood. So if you reflect on the remarks made by Professor Weiler, and what would be the points you'd like to address if we are talking about statehood in the way you asked us and you reminded us that we need to reconceptualize statehood in the 21st century?
Before that, this was a really fascinating exchange between you and Professor Weiler, an exchange of insiders.
No. You're an insider too, and you gave a clue.
But it's not the insider issue here, the degree of resolution here is much too low for me, or much too high for me. But both of you discuss these measures, and I agree, taxation is a very important feature or foundation of sovereignty, and army service or security is the main manifestation of sovereignty. But what is the aim? And I think that in your discussion, or the Professor Weiler's suggested reform, the aim, the implicit aim, is to create a state of Europe. The European Union becomes a state. And I don't think that this is a declared goal, agreed upon goal. And it's very difficult to promote actual reforms without seeing, what is the goal of these reforms. Do we want to build something that never existed, supranational creature that doesn't exist and doesn't resemble anything else? Or do, these steps are aiming to what we know, a sovereign state? But I think the more important point here is that too much expectations can create also a much greater fallback. If the EU would have remained in a kind of a pre-Maastricht stage, Britain would not leave. Maybe the frustration, the Euroscepticism that we see today would not rise. And I think that this is, when you set expectations, very high expectations, and you fail, the reaction can be much harder than not setting such expectations. And I think, this is a very, very delicate balance, because you want to progress something, you want to change something, but if you stretch too much, you'll get a reaction. And you might want to, we don't talk about American politics or the state of the US or the state of other countries, but there are other examples. So I think that, first, kind of putting forward suggestions without seeing what is the goal is problematic. And second, setting a goal which is unachievable in the near future can be also a very dangerous thing. I was talking on a very different level, of a level of the fact that the notion of electing representative to make for us decision is not failing only in this new creature of the European Union, but is failing in very established democracies. And I think that very deeply, there is no justification, philosophical justification to the way that we conduct ourselves. If we want to conduct ourselves where the aim is to maximize the well-being of the collectives that we govern or we self-govern, well-being is not money, wealth. It's an important combination of various values. There is a very strong, by the way, new literature about how to measure and how to promote well-being. But we have to change the way that we govern ourselves. For example, expert decision making, as now we see in the context of our crisis today, might be of a different weight or not considered as non-democratic. Representation, if we cannot make direct democracy and direct debate, although technology can enable us, and this is, by the way, in the European Union context, a very important thing, that geography is playing less and less of an important role. But I don't see this materializing in the EU. Communities that are not or arranged according to geographical borders, but according to set of minds, preferences, values. Electing, or I think in Belgium they came with such a proposal to elect representative, not to elect representative, but to make a lottery among qualified people to be representative for a certain time. We have to find various ways that will increase the trust in our system. And at this time, trust, we talked about solidarity, we talked about arms, we talked about security, tax, but trust is also a very fundamental component of a success of a polity. And to increase this trust, we have to find new ways, because one of the crisis of democracy today is lack of trust in our elected politicians, because we don't think that they represent ourselves. And the EU has special problems in this field. Other countries have other problems, but it's a mutual problem of old style representative democracy. So this is what I mean by, rethinking how to govern ourselves from scratches, from, philosophical foundations of what we want to achieve, well-being or unanimous decision-making, and so forth, so on, and then following step by step according to the abilities that we have today to create what institutions we want to have and how decision-making process should be conducted. And so in a sense, this is kind of in a similar track of the reforms, which are very, very revolutionary in the European context that Professor Weiler proposed. But I think even to go, I propose even to go further step backwards to set what are our goals in the realm of political philosophy or community or collective life, and according to them to try to structure a new kind of government for ourselves or for yourself in the European Union.
Thank you very much. Time, unfortunately, is running. I'd like to remark and then come to questions from Jed. I think you also said, the great expectations, and maybe if the European Union would have remained that kind of, economic market integration thing, maybe we would not face any of these problems, which I think is a very interesting idea, and you hear it very often in politics. And of course, hypotheses and history do not go well hand in hand, but I'm often wondering, if the European Union had decided to, we give up all that kind of spillover things, and we remain and stay as a functional market, whether or not the same politicians would argue that has been the mistake of the European Union. Now she is so narrow, she's a market only, she did not develop further, and therefore we might face other problems and other crises phenomena, but maybe crises phenomena that also would challenge the legitimacy of a pure functionalist market integration based European Union. I have two questions from the chat. The first question was regarding the argument, do we need a common army? Who is, so to speak, the enemy? Are we talking about Russia? Are we talking about, some kind of, external threats? And is it necessary if, people would kind of, peacefully live together? I think that's the old tricky question. Is it only governments that, engage in war with each other, or is it the people? And the second question, I think that's also something which is on the table here, raised by Anne Dienelt. Are there some positive effects by the crisis we are experiencing? Are there some kind of, good things that we can learn and that we can use the crisis to improve. That's the old crisis-driven narrative that, out of a crisis, there's always maybe some kind of catharsis and improvement. But, sometimes also, and I'm now very provocative, if there is a crisis, I read the other day, there are two options. The patient either recovers or the patient is dead. And that is also an option which we ignore, but it's out there on the table, hopefully not for the European Union. Professor Weiler, how would you address these two questions from the
Do we need a European army? The greatest success of the European construct is that statement, which seemed totally silly when it was made in the Schuman Declaration, which said, we will not only make war materially impossible, but unthinkable. And it was stupid because we didn't make more materially impossible. Within 10 years, Germany had the strongest army in Europe. But we did make it unthinkable, a huge success. It's just not part of the vocabulary of Western European, now West and East, to solve problems by war. And that's a huge success. The question is, do we believe the world also believes in that? If you do, then we don't need a European army. But I just want to remind people of European history and Christopher Clark's book, Sleepwalking. Mm-hmm. And then what do we do? So it's a very good question. It's a profound question, but I think it depends on that. The thing that we can learn, I agree with what Ellie said with one qualification. I don't think what I suggested is moving to a state, because I think that, for example, the army, it's not what's on people's mind. Whether European Union should retrench is in areas of social policy, of church and state, for example, of labor law, etc. There's scope for more. If you want federal experimentation in the member states, we want to do it our way. We don't want to have 6 weeks holiday a year. We want to have 4 weeks or 12 weeks, etc. We don't need that level of harmonization of social policy. I think that's much more on people's mind and create much more resentment. What we can learn, one big lesson, I think, let's take the recovery fund. I think now today, most European citizen thinks it is a good thing. It's taxation through the back door.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's taxation through the back door. It's a transfer union through the back door. Why not have it open and transparent? I say, of all the things I said, I think it's the least likely to happen, because Europeans would accept an integrated army before they accepted European taxation. But I just wanted to put it on the agenda because I think taxation is so important for our democratic life. Now, two little comments on what Ellie said. I think he put his finger on the real hottest topic. Are we willing to get good results, even if we do not? In other words, what we do is good, even if how we do it is not good from a democratic point of view, even with his reconceptualization, a different way of thinking of exercise of public power, etc. And why is that such a critical issue? Here I owe it to the Spanish philosopher whose death I still mourn, Francisco Rubio Llorente. He once made a really dramatic statement. He said, I'm worried about the success of the European Union, and he was a real pro-European. Why am I worried about the success? Because it gets people used to the idea that as long as the results are good, they don't have to worry about the democratic process. It corrupts our democratic sensibility. And therefore, when we think about the future of Europe in this context, the debate should be not as it is now what we should be doing, but how we should be doing what we are doing. And there's too little of that. I was more conventional. I'm proud to be an 18th century Democrat. Ellie was more 22nd century. Take your pick. But in that respect, we were saying the same thing. How we do it is as important as what we do.
Yeah, I agree more, Professor Salzberger.
Very, very well, nice put by Professor Weiler. And I subscribe totally to the answer regarding armies. We have to we have to acknowledge that there are vicious people and vicious forces and vicious states. And not everybody is thinking of only about democracy, liberalism, and freedom. And Israel, you know, I come from Israel, which is probably one of the few countries which doesn't have a real club, okay, in geographical or, you know, it has a very, very strong alliance with the United States and reliance on the United States. But the whole exercise of working in a club of countries is very alien to us. And also, of course, from a military perspective, you know, we try to rely only on ourselves, which creates a lot of problems. But one word with regard to the lessons of the current crisis, I think maybe, and this can be also examined in more sophisticated and expert specialist eyes, there is a need to strengthen the crisis management elements of the EU. You know, maybe, you know, giving authorities to the EU as an institution over sovereign member state authorities in time of crisis is easier. Not in time of crisis, but as preparation for some kind of an emergency constitution, which the German, you know, hesitated to legislate because of the Weimar failure until the 60s, and it's a very, very limited emergency constitution. But some kind of emergency arrangement, which will not be the regular politics of Europe in times of extreme conditions, which on the one hand will be, you know, helpful to manage crisis together, and on the other hand can be also a model, a possible model for a peacetime or a normal way of governance and decision-making processes. So this is my small recommendation regarding the lessons from this current crisis and previous crisis of the EU.
Thank you very much. In the chat, J.H.H, she's also a member of our forum, reminded us that, you know, establishing a European army might be a good idea, but if we do so, we need to be aware of the different traditions of the member states, and maybe we should then think of a new type of army that had to be founded to make things work. It's again, you know, we need to be aware not only what we are doing, but we need to be aware of how we are doing it, as Professor Weiler said, so also the institutional dimension and of course the procedural dimension. Time is unfortunately running. And, you know, I really hope that I may raise a last question, which is a particular tricky one, but it's been out there in both of your presentation, and that's the question of, you know, liberal democracy and the crisis of liberal democracy, which we see within the European Union. Professor Weiler said in a wonderful way, we believed for a long time that the European Union has internal strengths, and the problem is only to translate that internal strength into external strengths. But now we have internally a problem, and the problem is very often labeled illiberal democracy, which in my perspective is a contradiction in itself. If it's illiberal, it's not a democracy in the sense I see democracy, but of course there can be lots of disputes. But that's not a purely European phenomenon, and most unfortunately, as both of you also mentioned, it's a phenomenon not only of the so to speak usual suspects, but most traditional, very traditional democracies such as France, such as to some extent Germany, the United States of America show these tendencies. What are, in your opinion, the reasons for this, you know, kind of very dangerous new trend, and what would be the remedy? You said, Professor Salzberger, maybe trust in politicians and in policies. That could be one of the remedies, but of course that's a very, very tricky and a very problematic dimension. And so maybe we do it this time the other way around. Professor Salzberger, the floor is yours, and then the last remark by Professor Weiler. You know, that's the thing with illiberal democracies.
Well, I totally subscribe to what you said, that an illiberal democracy is not a democracy because democracy is not only majority rule. That is exactly what I emphasized, that the foundation of the idea of democracy is actually a social contract, an agreement, a unanimous agreement, or maximization of utility for the well-being of the population, etc. But I think that, first of all, we have to be prepared to challenge to the challenges on the theoretical level that, for example, the Chinese are putting in front of us, okay? Unlike our debate here, which I think all of us really find these fundamental values of freedom, liberty, and so forth as the cornerstone of our collective life. They offer a whole philosophical, political philosophy alternative. Meritocracy. You know, it's not election. It's the best in all fields who climbs up and then becomes the chairman. And we have to, you know, this is a challenge because they are an emerging force globally. And, you know, we talk about the crisis of a liberal democracy, but the world was never dominated by liberal democracies. Not in number of countries and not in the size of world population. The world population, the majority of which lives under autocracies, authoritarian regimes, which most of them do not have an alternative philosophy. But here we have a challenge of an alternative philosophy. We have to meet this challenge. And I think that for that reason, the idea of thinking fresh, how to govern, and for this reason, I said that, you know, there are immense opportunities for the European Union because it's not yet one unit. But this should, you know, be a very different kind of an exercise. As I said before, you know, I think that the decline of liberal democracy is the result of technological developments, and we have to adjust ourselves to the 21st century. I don't want to repeat myself, but those reforms in current institutions are not sufficient to overcome the main obstacles or problems of legitimacy, trust, and the failures of the assumptions of 18th century philosophers in our current days.
Thank you so much, Professor Weiler.
I think we only have 3 minutes, so I have to disappoint you, or maybe actually the people watching will be grateful. It's too big a theme to even begin to discuss in 3 minutes, but I do have thoughts about it, iconoclastic thoughts, provocative thoughts. So if you want, I can send you some links to some things I've written about it, and that could be part of the patrimony of this seminar that you have organized. But I really think in 3 minutes to talk about what accounts for large segments, they haven't become all fascists. There are not 20 million Polish fascists. It's true also for Hungary, etc. So why are they turning their back on liberal democracy? I have some iconoclastic thoughts. I will send you some links.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful answer. And I already got enthusiastic responses from the audience, and everybody says yes. I, of course, know it's impossible to answer that question in such a short time. And it's very important that you help us with these links, that we can continue amongst ourselves these discussions, which, of course, are at the very core of the whole Hamburg-Vigoni Forum project. I thank you very much for that wonderful, very exciting, very thought-provoking discussion and insightful views. Those of you have proven that you are perfect insiders in whatever kind of, you know, meaning of the word. So there is no question about that. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience, you know, for listening this afternoon and for raising questions. Many, many thanks. Have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we see each other tomorrow. And again, thank you very much to Professor Weiler and Professor Salzberger. That was really an iconic debate, and hopefully we can repeat that sometimes in the future. Thank you very much. Have a good night and see you soon.